Good afternoon and welcome to today's Harvard Data Science Initiative Industry Seminar. I'm Jen Chow. I'm Director of External Engagement for the HDSI. Today, I am delighted to welcome Amy Hood and Nick Galasso from Oxfam America. If you're not familiar with Oxfam, it's a global organization that fights inequality to end poverty and injustice with foci on economic justice and equal rights, women's rights and gender justice, climate action, and humanitarian response. Amy Hood is a program specialist in program data systems and analysis. Her work focuses on applying feminist principles to every step of the data lifecycle while building user-centered data products like dashboards and reports. At Oxfam, she co-founded DataPack, a staff-led community of practice dedicated to staff who work with data, which has trained dozens in everything from quantitative data analysis to feminist data ethics. She's an avid student of examining and dismantling power in data work. Nick Galasso is currently head of research and leads a team of researchers covering a broad range of issues across Oxfam's portfolio. He's the main researcher for Oxfam's work on economic inequality and focuses on the intersection of elites, extreme wealth, and political capture. In 2014, he co-authored the Oxfam report calculating that the richest 85 people in the world have the same wealth as the poorest half of humanity. Prior to Oxfam, Galasso taught international relations and political economy at Chestnut Hill College and the University of Delaware, from which he also holds a PhD in global governance. Before we get started, I'd like to remind folks that we'll be using Zoom's Q&A function, so please feel free to enter any questions you have for our speakers there. They'll be answering questions after their remarks. And so with that, thank you, Amy and Nick, for joining us. Please take it away.
Thanks so much for having us. So I'm going to not talk through most of our first slide because it's just a little bit about what Oxfam is, and we already just got a wonderful introduction of what Oxfam is. So I'm not going to talk too much through just a couple of examples of our work that speak to the life-saving support. An example of that is our humanitarian response in Yemen. And an example of our advocacy work is advocacy around equal access to the COVID-19 vaccine. So just to get a flavor for the types of things that we are involved in as Oxfam America, those are some two examples. But we're not just talking about Oxfam today, we're talking about Oxfam and data. And I want to start us off with just a very, very, very quick review of the context that we're operating in with data. So we want to talk about external and internal context. Externally, we actually have a really long history of analyzing external data sources and using it for advocacy purposes. This includes when we use it for killer facts, which is going to be the kind of the crux of what Nick is going to talk us through and how we use killer facts and the kind of benefits and detriments to doing that. So we sort of have a presence externally using data in this way, but internally, which is sort of my realm, it's kind of a different story. The data that we collect, analyze, and use, our data ecosystem internally, and this is not uncommon for many organizations that have been around for a while, that data ecosystem is fractured and shallow. Our data sources often don't talk to one another. It's hard to access sort of the full picture of everything that we have available. There's a lot of shadow Excel reports, shadow documents living in many different places that hold pieces of our data ecosystem. And when we talk about our data ecosystem as a whole, the data that is there is, first of all, not always available, but if it is available, it might not be usable. If it is usable, it might not be reliable. And if it is reliable, it might not be comparable year over year. So that's sort of like the really quick version of what sort of where we are right now, but I'm going to hand it over to Nick. He's going to talk us through some of those external pieces and specifically give an example of killer facts and how that's being used in the research department. So I will hand it over to Nick.
Thanks, Amy. Thanks, everybody, for having us today to come and talk about the ways in which we think about, interact, use data, both how we're thinking it through both internally as we develop more of a feminist data culture, and also how we've traditionally worked on used data in our external engagement with the world. I thought the clearest way to maybe talk about the external dimension would be through the use of what we call killer facts or killer statistics. We kind of use those terms interchangeably. I think whether you've registered it or not, you've probably been inundated with killer facts and killer stats throughout your life, often just by popping on the news or surfing the web. Killer stats or killer facts are really the use of data as a communication tool to evoke shock or surprise, or to raise the salience of an issue among the media, among decision makers, or the public. Hopefully, all of those, all three of those. I guess the way that I would describe a killer stat or a killer fact would be the simple deployment of quantitative data points. These are often simple comparisons that are used to demonstrate the severity of some issue. So for example, when I was a kid, I'd often see commercials saying something like, for the price of a cup of coffee a day, you could help eliminate global poverty, right? As if the problem of global poverty was solvable by something as simple as everybody chipping in $1 or the price of a cup of coffee. But the point here is that they are useful because they are quotable, they're media accessible, they can, as I just did there, they can be easily recalled, and they concisely illustrate both what a problem is and often what the solution might be. Oxfam, like other organizations, relies on data to generate killer facts and killer statistics. And we do this to advance the causes and issues that we work on. Quite matter-of-factly, we use them to get headlines in the press with the hope that policymakers and that influential people will quote them, that they will distill down into the public, who will hear them and share them in conversations and share them on social media or over conversation and coffee and other places, and that that they will in effect go viral and help spur action on the issues that we are concerned with. So let's go to the first stat, which was already mentioned by Jen during my bio here. So the first killer statistic that I wanted to talk about is this one that's on the screen here, which is our calculation that the richest 85 people own the same wealth as the bottom 3.5 billion poorest people, or the bottom half of the human population. This is a statistic that we calculated in 2014 and was included in a report that we wrote, which was Oxfam's first statement about economic inequality. It was sort of us planting a flag in terms of laying why we're concerned with the issue of income and wealth inequality and what solutions we sought to advance to reduce extreme inequality. For those that are interested, this statistic is calculated largely from two sources. The first is the annual wealth report that is made available each fall by Credit Suisse, which gives a robust set of data on estimates about how much wealth exists in the world at different levels. We were essentially able to use this to kind of slice up estimates about how much wealth was captured or owned by different tiers of the population, meaning that we were able to say things like, the richest 10% own 80% of global wealth, for example. So that's not an exact number right there, but just to give you an example, it's probably close to something like that. But from this analysis, we were able to identify that the poorest 50% of the human population, according to the Credit Suisse data, really captures about 0.71% of global wealth. We were able to translate that into an actual number. And what we did was with that number was to then look at the Forbes billionaire list, which updates regularly the wealth that's owned by the world's billionaires, and see how many billionaires it took to essentially equate to that figure owned by the bottom half of humanity. What is good about this statistic, in my perspective, is that it's easily, we can update it annually quite easily by using these two sources. And in fact, we do update these figures annually. We release them on the eve of the World Economic Forum, which happens in Davos in January every year. So it's good because the media, people have come to anticipate or expect that this statistic will be updated. Data permitting, this methodology can be replicated at the national level if you have data on the distribution of wealth within the society, and then also a list of billionaire wealth and the like. This statistic was also good for us in terms of our brand, because people came to not only associate this statistic with Oxfam, but that Oxfam is an organization that works on inequality. This was important for us because the organization sought to essentially shift its identity in the public mind from being an organization about poverty to being one about inequality. And this was a good way to help shift that perception among the public. I think that this statistic is also powerful because it's easy to understand, right? It articulates the message precisely. Economic inequality is wildly out of control. And then lastly, I think a benefit or a contribution that this statistic made was that it helped raise the narrative of inequality within the public discourse. So thinking back, particularly in the United States before 2014, 2013, I mean, we didn't hear much about inequality, right? Or you were sort of initially labeled as a socialist or a communist if you were talking about inequality, and it's become more normalized to talk about these issues now. We think that this statistic and the work that we've done on inequality has helped to normalize that conversation in a way. And then just lastly, I would say that this statistic was useful because it lends itself to prodding people to wanting to go deeper. Why is wealth inequality so massive, right? And we were able to kind of pivot that to some of our perceptions on what drives inequality and what has created such an unequal dynamic in terms of wealth inequality around the world. Okay, let's look at the next one here. So this is a statistic that I calculated earlier this year, which got a lot of media attention. Essentially, it's a calculation that women lost about $800 billion in income during the first year of the pandemic. We were, early 2021, we were interested in this question about how much income women lost because of COVID. The assumptions that we were coming into this work with were that, women do most of the unpaid care work in households, and so would have to stay home to attend and care for those whom are sick, and that women more regularly worked in industries and jobs that were informal or vulnerable, and that were more likely to be shut down or curtailed because of COVID restrictions. There are other assumptions that kind of fed into why we were interested in this question. The way that we were able to come up with this figure was using publicly available data from the International Labor Organization to determine how many jobs women lost between the end of 2019 compared to the end of 2020, and then compare that to the jobs lost by men to see who lost more. Our calculations were that women lost globally about 5% of jobs, men lost about 4% of jobs. So women lost more. We then were able to calculate an average annual income for women around the world and look at what the difference was between the 2 years, which gave us what we consider to be a conservative estimate of about $800 billion. And I say this is a conservative estimate because, as you can imagine, trying to ask a question like this or develop, data points on a question as large as this and as nuanced as this is quite difficult. And part of that is just a result of data limitations, the nuances of reality, right? To what extent does national level statistics on employment capture the experience of informal workers, for example? To some extent, the ILO data does generate estimates to help us get a sense of what those parameters might be. But it was quite interesting because others were asking the same question and came up with much larger figures. A couple figures pointed more towards suggesting that women lost about $1 trillion in income. But for us, given the calculations and the methodologies that we utilize, we figured that it was better for us to be on the conservative side than to kind of be stretching or reaching. And we felt that we were being, just rigorous and essentially, being conservative, being rigorous, as engaging in killer statistics, you always have to be mindful essentially of how reputable the data is that you're putting out there. So this is just to say that we agonize over the production of these statistics. We put them through a process of external peer review so that we feel that we are putting reputable stuff out there. This data point was important for us because it was an opportunity to leverage and to talk about a number of issues that Oxfam is concerned with and does work around. So for example, gender pay disparity, disparity in care work between women and men. We use the statistic to pivot to talk about the lack of public services and social protection in many countries for the unemployed and underemployed. We use this to talk about the inequality among countries and regarding how the virus was being fought. We didn't use this for International Women's Day, but the idea was that, and this is something that we think about when we construct killer statistics, is what could be the moment or the media hook that we could use to kind of propel a statistic like this to get the biggest impact. Okay, next slide, please. This is a statistic that came out late in during the summer. This is a statistic that I didn't work on, but I thought that it was interesting to share with you all because it did get a lot of pickup. This is from a paper called The Hunger Virus. And essentially the killer stat here is that every minute 11 people die of hunger, but we were relating this to the impact of COVID. So this statistic essentially used data to determine that by the end of 2020, 12,000 people a day may have been dying from hunger linked to COVID-19. And this was potentially more people than that would have died just from the disease, the disease alone. Again, this is an opportunity that we use to link the current crisis to traditional issues that Oxfam works on and issues that people come to know us by. So, we have a long history of working on issues of hunger and inequality in the food system. I don't have it up here, but there was a related killer fact or killer statistic that was associated with this report that I think also really kind of nails the messaging that we were trying to get here. The second killer statistic in this piece suggested that 8 of the biggest food and drink companies paid out over $18 billion to shareholders between January 2020 and when this report came out, even as the pandemic was spreading across the globe, and that this was 10 times more than had been requested in UN COVID-19, the UN COVID-19 appeal to stop people going hungry. So what's interesting there is, again, like the richest 85 stat, this is a good example of using comparisons. In this case, it's the number of deaths compared to shareholder payout. Okay, let me show you one more slide here. So this is an example of when killer statistics or killer facts go wrong. This is a statistic that has been floating around in the public sphere for honestly about 40 years. As you can see from the slide here, it suggests that women perform 66% of the work, produce 50% of the food, but only earn 10% of the income and own only 1% of property. Most of these factoids, right? So the 66% of work, the 10% of income, and the 1% of property dates back to some very fuzzy research from the late 1970s. I think it was an International Labor Organization report that really didn't even have any citations of where these figures come from, but somehow it gets perpetuated in the public. It kind of takes on a life of its own. And as much as we try to stop it or abate it, the statistic just won't go away. So, we call these zombie statistics. These are like statistics that essentially take on a life of their own and essentially just won't die, right? I think there's a lot of problems with these being continuing to be in circulation, and certainly harks back to why this work needs to be centered in kind of rigorous and peer review work. I mean, the fact that we were seeing these statistics flying around even up to about 5 or 6 years ago, which is, wildly unresponsible, I would just say, in a lot of ways, right? Because first off, this data is so incredibly dated, right? It doesn't recognize how the world has changed in the last 40 years. But it's just kind of maddening. Like these statistics were quoted by numerous organizations in the last few decades without any citation or any sourcing. My organization, Oxfam, it's embarrassing to say, but we were still circulating this statistic around until 2016. And as you can see on the image there, the sourcing that we labeled for it was just UNDP, right? Not even a particular paper or particular citation. The UNDP did come to recognize that and did make a public statement saying, we know that these data are bad and we haven't used them for since 2011, I think. So I wanted to just offer an example of kind of when this stuff goes bad. So I'm gonna wrap up here. I just want to say, just some final words on the use of killer facts and killer statistics in our work. Just to be quite honest, it's something that we do and we find to be effective, but it's certainly something that we struggle with. Just because we get a lot of media hits with a particular statistic, it doesn't mean that we're actually engaging in any sort of real social change, right? Hopefully we've at least raised severity around an issue, but it doesn't necessarily mean that legislatures or policymakers have engaged in some sort of rectifying action around that issue. I think secondly, what's very important for us is we also have to think about the ethics of often quantifying suffering for media attention, to put it quite bluntly. We worry about killer stats and killer facts glossing over the nuance of often complicated issues like global wealth inequality and hunger. And we are also asking questions about how this kind of work is feminist, and does the production of these stats, how does it interplay with the fostering or the development of a feminist data culture? We don't necessarily have answers to these questions, but I want to impart to you that these are live questions that we are grappling with. So, questions about where does our data come from? Who is represented in that data? Does this data actually empower people? Does it challenge power hierarchies? Which for me is, quintessential to doing feminist work. I think on the plus side, I think that killer stats can certainly be feminist, particularly if we are making data or knowledge more accessible to larger groups of people. I think that's an empowering act. But we have to ask, who are we trying to reach? What are we trying to say? Who are the people that are being captured within these data points? Who benefits from this work? So I'm going to stop there, I think, and hand it off to Amy to talk about how we've been building a feminist data culture at Oxfam.
And all of the questions that I think Nick was raising and in how we grapple with a particular application of data work is the kinds of questions we really want to be fostering more and discussion more in the work that I've been really lucky to convene, which is DataPack. So I'm going to transition us to DataPack. DataPack is a staff-led community of practice dedicated to anyone who works with data at Oxfam. We really do believe that's everybody. I would be shocked and hard-pressed to find anybody who doesn't open up their computer and go to work at Oxfam every day and interact with some form of data. But we are a data-focused group. So from DataPack, what we do, and to Nick's point about these kinds of feminist questions we want to be asking ourselves when we work with data, we are really dedicated to creating the foundations, building the foundations, because we're certainly not there yet, of a feminist data culture at Oxfam. So we create this community that's, we're working to be safe and inclusive and data focused. And we're collaborating on a data learning agenda in hopes that both of these things will contribute to the creation of a feminist data culture. So I'm going to backtrack just a little bit. I wanted to kind of connect to DataPack, but I also want to talk about what I mean when I talk about a data culture and what I mean when I say feminist in front of it too, because we don't want to just put the word feminist assume that everybody means the same thing and that we're all talking on the same about the same thing when we talk about feminism. But data culture is typically a term that just speaks to the culture which enables an organization to get the most value out of its data, enables an organization to make data-driven decisions. You know that a data culture exists when you have a budget for data, when your organization is investing in data management, knowledge production, data systems. You also know you have a data culture when data is not just for IT, it's not just for evaluation, it's not just for the researchers. It is really seen as something that everybody should have some basic literacy in. And it's also people are enabled and supported to access it, make sense of it, derive insight from data, regardless of where they sit. It's really something that people are enabled to engage with. And finally, when data is independently used by staff. So staff can identify data when they see it, and they offer creative ways to use data to solve problems. I heard a presentation once which gave the example for data culture and why a data culture matters, with a metaphor that I thought was really, really useful, which talked about, if you considered your data analyst, your data scientist as, a bricklayer, and the data as the bricks, as the thing that builds the whatever structure you end up building. The data culture is all the other things that go into building a building besides the data, the bricklayers and the bricks, right? There is plans, structure, ideas. How tall is the building? How wide is the building? If you just gave a bunch of bricklayers some bricks and told them to lay bricks, it may not necessarily come into the building that you're imagining. So this is kind of what we need to have our data analysts, data scientists, data workers have the environment that they need to be successful at what they do. And it's really important for us to be able to have that data-driven environment where we can make really good decisions using data. But I also want to talk about feminist data culture, because it's not just important for us to get value out of data, it's important for us to get a value out of data in a feminist way. And so Data Pack members came together to really say, okay, what does that actually mean? We kind of use this word a lot sometimes, and we don't always know what we mean when we say it. So I'm going to kind of go through what Data Pack members at least thought it means to them. The first and probably most obvious is that it's about evaluating power. The understanding that data is a form of power, and that power influences what data is available, what questions you might be asking of the data, who is prioritizing the data that you have. Data culture that is feminist requires data workers to understand what power is and how it shows up in their work. And it also requires them to mitigate it where appropriate. So having the tools and capacities to say, where do I need to make a change, or where do I need to make my bias known, or maybe there are certain things that we don't need to be talking about, or things we do need to be talking about, really understanding who is in the room and why. I can speak to more specific examples, but power is everywhere, and it's absolutely in your data work. And if your data culture is not aware of it, it's going to be reinforcing the same systems of oppression that have always existed. Accessibility is really important, and I've read a lot of data culture articles that just talk about accessibility in the sense of hey, make sure that people have access to your database, which is absolutely that. But we like to think about accessibility in a little bit more of a broad sense as well, in thinking about what are the barriers to access that are more than just the lock and key to the database, or the lock and key to the certain Excel file, or wherever your data is stored. What are the barriers that somebody might have to be able to engage with and use a piece of data, or be able to make sense of that data? So that might be thinking about screen reader access. It might be thinking about how people take certain information in. It might be thinking about who your audience is, or who your staff are, and what kinds of skills and capacities they have and needs they have, and making sure that data is accessible to them, given all of those unique factors. Stewardship is a really big piece of a feminist data culture. So you have to steward data as a form of power. That's things like free, prior, informed consent when you collect data. It's thinking about how you store data that actually protects the privacy of the data, making sure that the data is used in the way that it was intended by when it was collected, and just generally being aware of data rights and honoring them. Inclusion and transparency are pretty straightforward. They're probably what you think of when you think of inclusion and transparency, but data work, how we work together, matters just as much as what we deliver when we talk about feminist data culture. So cultivating work environments that are safe, appreciative, and welcoming, and spaces to talk about, upskill, and discuss data that are transparent and flat by preference. So how we work together as data workers matters just as much as what kinds of data products we produce. And finally, it's important to note, it's not the most important thing, but it's important to note that this work requires a genuine engagement and application of feminist theory to data work. Our feminist journeys are never done. There's never a point where we can sort of just like, you know, we've gotten everything, we've understood all power, we have no more work left to do. So having a genuine intention to engage with feminist theory on data work and a genuine desire to understand how power shows up and how we can mitigate power is really necessary for feminist data culture, because it really is never done. So I'm now going to talk about what DataPact is doing to try to get to these very high goals. They're really big goals. We're no way near necessarily where we want to be, and probably never will be, right? It's never done. So I'm going to start with learning, which is the biggest part of what DataPact does, which is to try to create a space where we can learn about and upskill in data work. The biggest mechanism for that is learning groups. So these are mini self-organized communities that learn skills that are democratically selected. So we have a small budget, and we offer a chance for people to get together and say, what do you want to learn about with data? We've hosted 2 learning groups in the last year. And one was for quantitative learning. That group selected SQL and Power BI as the 2 quantitative tools that they wanted to learn more about. And then the other was qualitative learning, and that group selected Deduce as a tool that they wanted to learn more about. So these are sort of spaces where staff can determine what they want to learn about, but also how they want to learn it. These groups literally select everything from, are we learning e-learning? Are we going and paying for a facilitated learning event? How often are we meeting? How long do we meet? Do we keep meeting? And they sort of have these like iterative functions to be able to make sure that they learn. And I think for the most part, we found that these are really effective. When we came to our 3-month or I think it was a 3-month check-in with our SQL group, and we're like, would you put SQL on your resume? And like the large majority of people said that they would put SQL on their resume. So it's just to say that like this is a mechanism that people are feeling confident enough to be able to talk about their skills and talk about their skills externally with other people. So obviously that's great. It's great to learn in a community, but we've also found that the best way to learn is to have application of it. So we also have another piece of learning that's around products, which is creating low-risk environments where staff can have a chance to try out their skills. So if you've learned SQL, or you learned Power BI, or you learned Deduce, or maybe in the future we'll be learning other tools like R or Python, whatever it may be, you learned that, let's find an opportunity to try it out and try it on work that is relevant and makes sense in our field. So these are demand-driven products that are used to solidify the skills that we've learned, and we delivered 4 of them last year. The last 2 are just sort of complementary to the first 2, but problem solving is really about solving pain points. What challenges are you having with your data work? Can you just not get data entry to happen on your team? People are not filling out the things that you need to do, or is there data quality a big issue on your team? And it's also a space to tackle shared issues. So we've had larger discussions on things like feminist forecasting, like how do I create a data tool that enables open and democratic decision-making on my team, that allows people to understand how we plan to use our money this year and where that money is going, at least shares information and maybe even shares some some of the decision-making power? How do I get my team to report their activities and be able to show them what they're delivering on? How do I use that for monitoring, evaluation, and learning? And what kind of tools support that? What can I use? These are shared problems, and we were able to come up with some shared solutions associated with these shared problems. And finally, we have Feminist Data Ethics Book Club. Through the pandemic, this has become incredibly informal, but I think it's still a really rich space where we just come together and say, what are you aware of in the data world and how power shows up in the data world? What do you want to talk about today? In the past, we read full books. We read Weapons of Mass Destruction, a couple of articles on, the right to be counted and things like that. But through the pandemic, it's been largely TED Talks and YouTube videos, which we watch and then discuss together. Topics have included natural language processing and what gets, data, what data sets exist with that and why, and who gets studied and why. Application of decoloniality theory plus data. So what does it mean to look at data as something that either can be used to like a colonizing perspective or not, and also like how we study data about whom. Data for DEI, so how data can support diversity, equity, and inclusion work, how we can think about diversity, equity, inclusion work using data, but also diversity, equity, and inclusion data on data work. So even just the types of data we collect, that many different options, if you are asked for your gender, how do you collect the different options for gender? Or are you reinforcing a binary when you, collect certain data about gender, etc. And then finally, feminist data visualization. So it's just some topics that we've just grappled with together, by no means have answers on, but are trying to have rich discussions on what does it mean to evaluate power in data work, and how do we not only are aware of what's going on in the data world, but also take these principles and apply them on the work that we're all doing internally. So learning is our biggest area, and it's really how we want to be seen in the organization. But there's also work associated with just creating a community and creating hopefully a safe and inclusive community for people to come together, creating that vessel in which these conversations can happen. The community size itself, we started in February of 2019. We had 8 founding members. We're stable at 40. And we've been probably about 40 for the last year through the pandemic, which we're actually super proud of, that we've managed to stay at 40 through massive, massive change. We've had a pandemic, we've had leadership transitions, we've had staff turnover. A lot of change has happened at Oxfam through the pandemic, and we've managed to kind of stay at the same level. So when people have left, we've managed to fill in those roles and have more people in the group. So that's been exciting to see that this still exists. We also are really trying to make sure that we're taking an active and intentional approach in how our community management thinks about inclusion and safety. So the first is to have an opt-in diversity metrics within the group, just to understand if we're overrepresented in any one particular area. So we have an opt-in survey where people can choose or choose not to share different parts about, their background, their skills, their experience, their compensation, their age, sexual orientation, ability, racial identity, those kinds of things, so that we can understand if we're overrepresenting any particular way of being in the world, and just be aware of it if we need to mitigate it. And then also regularizing feedback mechanisms. So making sure it's not enough to have a space where to have a diverse space, but we also have to make sure that we have an inclusive space. So regularizing spaces and also providing multiple formats that people can say if things are going well or not, and what we need to change and how we need to change. DataPack is incredibly iterative. It's changed a lot in the last 2 years, and that's because we've actually created these, like, hey, how's it going? What's going on with you? Are you learning? If you're not learning, then why are you here? So that's kind of how we try to think about our community. And then just the culture work that's a little bit more explicit. So we think obviously the learning and the community management itself do contribute to creating a culture, but we are doing some explicit conversation starter type things to say, like, what does it mean to create this environment where we can work with data and get the most value out of data? So the scope of our products make sure to touch every division, and our members touch every division. So we think that data culture starts with good conversation and good relationships. So we want to make sure that we are talking to researchers like Nick and understanding what they're grappling with and understanding how they're working with data. We do want to make sure that we're touching every part of the organization and seeing where they are and kind of trying to get a sense of where the organization is in its thinking on data. And then we're also thinking about making that conversation a little bit wider. So we are hoping to do some trainings early next year to mid next year on some topics like data awareness, data literacy, data empowered, data and design thinking, and data in your career. So really trying to help us understand what data, like help the whole organization have a shared language for what data are, like how to read and make sense of data, how power shows up in data, how to make user-centered products, and how it affects careers. So I'm just going to leave with couple thoughts, couple lessons, maybe they're helpful, maybe they're not, but over the last 2 years of implementation of this particular project, what we've been learning, still are learning as we still continue to build, and we're certainly not there where we want to be, and there's so much more that we could be doing. But I've read a lot of data culture things that say like, hey, don't even bother if you don't have a leadership sponsor. And I want to offer that I wouldn't completely write off ground up approaches. Obviously, they have a ceiling. Obviously, if you're in an organization, whatever it may be, whether it be an academic institution or a nonprofit like Oxfam or a business overall, staff-led approaches can be really powerful. There will always be a tension between the desire to have a beautiful space in your work plan to just really dedicate to the data work that you're doing and to spend a lot of time on it. But there's also like an innovative space that exists when it's just people doing things that they're really passionate about and they get value from. And we've actually had a lot of success providing that value to staff in a largely informal space with a scrappy budget. I mean, the first year that we were working on Data Pack, I spent $20 on a Udemy course and was teaching Power BI. I was learning Power BI. We were all learning Power BI together. And we were like, how do we use this big, heavy tool to be able to tell better stories with our data and be able to have better communication with our managers, make better decisions. And that honestly helped me have a bit of a career change was having these spaces that were really informal where we were learning a lot. So that sort of connects to the providing staff value. So obviously, if you're going to go with ground up and it's going to be people's like time and passion that is going to drive it, you have to be making sure that they're getting something out of it. So what do staff need? What do they need right now? Can you provide it right now? So we've always really tried to stay very centered on like, what do staff need right now? Because even if everything else falls apart, we want this to be useful to staff right now. So if you can provide value to staff, that also creates longevity, it creates sustainability, it creates a space that will last. And when staff get value, so does the organization. When we figure out how to use Excel better, some of our members have been like, I'm a qualitative researcher. I don't know how to do anything quant, but hey, I took this quick Excel course with Data Pack, and now people look to me as if I'm somebody who can do a little bit of quantitative something with a pivot table or two, and I feel really amazing at being able to offer that to my team, which I wasn't able to do before. That provides, even if it's small, some amount of value to the organization, and it provides a lot of value on the individual level. Two more things. I do think it's important to see change as an opportunity. This work is really hard. But if you can find joy and some inspiration in figuring out what that feminist future can be, and really in imagining a better world, a better data work for you and your coworkers, that can be really, really helpful, can create some longevity as well for the group to continue. We've really leaned on each other in the last couple of years in those problem solving sessions, like, hey, I'm doing this really hard thing. How do I do this? What will help? And that's been really helpful. But also being able to sit there and dream about what kinds of things we'd love us to be able to do, what kinds of conversations we want to have, what kinds of data products we think are possible that could have something really valuable to say about some social justice issue that we're campaigning about, or whatever the case may be. If you can really hold on to that joy and inspiration, there's a longer road ahead that you can kind of keep going. And obviously, we've talked a little bit about this today, but don't forget power. Power is everywhere. If we're not analyzing it, we're reinforcing it. if we're not thinking about where the data is coming from, it's going to be coming from really common places. If we're not thinking about how we're analyzing analyzing our data and thinking about the kinds of really questioning ourselves on what we're prioritizing, who we're prioritizing it for, who benefits from the data products that we're creating, how we personally benefit from the data products we're creating, it's not going to be surprising to find that we're reinforcing systems of power that have always existed. So I think it's just really important. It's sticky, it's hard, but really starting on the journey of like, who benefits? How do I benefit? Why am I doing this data work at all? Where is my data coming from? Those kinds of questions are really, really important, and you kind of have to carry them with you as you go. So I think we've managed to finish up with about 15 minutes for questions if they exist. So.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much, Amy. Thank you, Nick. There are a few questions out there, and so if you don't mind, I'd like to start with thinking a little bit, you mentioned that DataPack is really building from the ground up. And I'd like to think about, what that interface is with the top-down approach, with leadership. So Hannah Correa asks, are nonprofit organizations like Oxfam and others creating policies for reliable and responsible data use and statistic creation as part of a change in culture surrounding data use? So in other words, have you been able to reach leadership and think about, how do you institutionalize some of the work that you're doing? Or, for example, is Oxfam's focus on reducing zombie statistics currently motivated and driven by employees?
So for the first question, we do have a responsible data policy that has been written. I think that there's sort of like, I don't know how you would feel about this, Nick, but like things that get written and sometimes then don't have the actual, how does this actually get applied? We do have the policy exists there, we've signed on to it, we've written it, it's there, but how well we know we're actually delivering on it is something that I think would be a question. So there's sort of like a bit of a back and forth between these sort of bubbles up of staff-led solutions, and then also like, hey, we've actually assigned a group of people to really think about what responsible data use looks like. This is what it should look like. But the short answer is yes, we do have a responsible data policy that thinks about some of these things and has a lot of relationships between the types of things we talk about in DataPack and how we use data as an organization. But I don't know if, Nick, you have anything to say about responsible data.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I would maybe clarify, actually, I don't even know if I'm totally right about this, Amy, so tell me if I'm wrong, but as we've been on this journey of moving from a sort of reductive kind of data organization to more of a robust data organization or an organization that takes data seriously, as you said, we have developed policies on the internal use of data management. But I think kind of relating to that second half of the question regarding zombie statistics, that's still sort of pertinent to how we as researchers utilize data that's out there in the world or data that we generate ourselves and then put it back out there. And I'll just say, the question of zombie statistics, thankfully, they are less of a problem now than they used to be in the past. And part of this is because of Oxfam's commitment to just getting better at research. So for the last decade or so, we've hired trained social scientists. We've developed a more robust research process that includes peer review on both the beginning end and when we're ready to go to publication. So I would say that we put out in the world better data, right? The problem with the zombie statistics is often those are things that were put out a long time ago, and they're zombies, right? They just won't die. Like for whatever reason, they continue to get sort of perpetuated. And sometimes, yes, that has been by our own organization. And often that's just, we're a big global organization that also sometimes fails in terms of coordination and knowledge sharing, right? But I think that the zombie statistic issue is one that we've come to kind of contain, just through improving the ways in which we go about data creation, knowledge creation, and the like.
You know, one of the things that we think about here at the Data Science Initiative is misinformation and trust in science. It's come up repeatedly, obviously, in the current pandemic, thinking about vaccines. And I appreciate what you're saying about, about your own ability to audit the information that you're putting out there. And I wonder if you've given any thought to how that information can be used to combat bad information that's out there. Does Oxfam think about, well, this is a tool that we are putting out there for our own purposes, but can we actually use it to, I don't want to say weaponize it, that's the wrong phrase, but can we use that to combat the bad information?
I think it's a really interesting question, and I'm going to kind of speak in maybe not such an official capacity, but one of the arenas of interest that I have for the last few years has been the rise of the extreme far right, and particularly the ways in which they utilize online sources, online communities to perpetuate an agenda that can often be misogynistic, can be violent, can be conspiratorial and the like, and it has impact on the issues that we work on. Climate change, human rights, women's rights, feminism, and I think in many ways that political program is perpetuated by a lot of misinformation, right? Fake news, whatever you want to call it. So a question that we've been asking ourselves is, should we engage in those spaces and say, no, these data points, this information is wrong, it's misleading, it's harmful and the like. Is this an appropriate place for us? So I think it's sort of, in that regard, it's sort of a live conversation that we've been having internally about, is that an appropriate space for us? I think that this might even touch on maybe on one of the other questions, but in the realm of economic inequality, we've put out a lot of statistics on the extent of wealth inequality, both at the global level and also at the national level and the regional level and the like. And, it's sparked challenges and debates, and we have used it, there is a strong narrative that says that economic inequality is actually probably a good thing. It means that markets are working. It means that there's opportunities in societies for people to get rich. We shouldn't worry about it so much. So I think that we often use our data and our knowledge creation to demonstrate, in fact, what are some of the more severe consequences of when inequality kind of runs out of control? What kind of societies does it create? Does it create more distrust in societies? Does it actually work against markets? So, it's a long-winded answer to your question to say that in some respects, we are thinking about it. And in fact, we do some of this stuff.
I think thinking a little bit more about when you're developing that killer stat. And there's a question of, developing it, but then also the process, right? The life of that stat. And thinking about generation, how often are you maybe using a strategic point to develop the killer stat? And how often do you find the killer stat coming to you and then finding that it is of use to maybe Oxfam's Oxfam strategies?
It's interesting. I mean, I think in my own experience, it's often, I want to be useful as a researcher, and I want to be useful as somebody who has a specific, very kind of limited range of skills. So we think about killer stats as part of a broader policy and advocacy strategy, right? It's not just about the stat. It's about sort of a long engagement of research around a particular problem where we are going to do good in-depth research to understand the issue and understand what are the most effective policy solutions that would affect that issue or reduce the severity of that problem. Killer stats are then, a lot of it often like, it's like, well, I'm going to go look at the data and just see what might be a salient feature that comes out of the data that would help advance that agenda, that would maybe get more eyeballs from the media or decision makers than a thick descriptive sort of research report and the like. So it's, I don't think I'm answering your question exactly in terms of things that might come to us. And I think what I'm trying to suggest is that we're often trying to be proactive about what we can actually, how we can engage with data to say something salient.
And I think that's a nice reminder too, that Oxfam doesn't necessarily work in a vacuum. There are other partners that you're engaging with when you're thinking about, what comes next after putting this information out there, or, what comes next on your advocacy, on your path toward advocacy.
Yeah, I would just quickly say, I mean, for a number of years, a lot of my work on inequality was about moving the international monetary, the IMF, the International Monetary Foundation, to do better and do more analysis, right? Like that's a big quant organization full of economists who study national economies, right? And so so the advocacy was around data. You should study inequality more. You should produce more statistics around national levels of inequality. You should do more quantitative work looking at how inequality impacts economic questions and the like. How does it impact questions of development? So we do, I would say, we do advocate around data in a lot of respects.
Thank you. Okay, so I think we have time for one more question, which is a really lovely one from Lucas Chu, who says, what should be our biggest takeaway? What should we do? What can we do? Either of you want to give a
lot.
What's that?
Amy, I feel like I talked a lot. I don't know if you want to take that one.
In terms of data culture, what should our biggest takeaway be? I think you start somewhere. I had one of the best pieces of advice with data culture that I found really helpful was to think about, so if you're trying to do something really big and you're trying to do an organization, like you're trying to change how your organization engages with data, how people think about data in your organization, whether or not they use it, whether or not they reach for it when they're about to make a decision. And there might be a lot of problems or barriers to that. Maybe you don't have great systems. Maybe you don't have the right skills in the room. Maybe people don't trust the data that you have. Maybe the quality is really bad. Whatever the problem may be, you might have some big problems. Don't go for the problem that you think would provide the most value to the organization as a whole. Go for the problem that gets people the most excited about it. What feels the most like, oh, that I would just love it if I could do X, if I could just go here and grab this thing, or if I could be able to see something really beautiful and be able to like consult this data product to be able to answer this question. So like whatever the problem, like there's lots of problems that might be like out there, but going for the one that people are going to get the most excited about, the solution that people are going to get most excited about is going to give you some longevity, because these, at least for older organizations that have a lot of building to do in order to create these environments where data analysts can do a lot of really amazing work and decisions can be made in a data-driven way. There's a lot of work to be done. So getting people excited about data is a better path forward and a longer, more sustainable path forward than doing the hard thing that might actually, get the most, perceived value. That's maybe the second thing you do, not the first.
Do you have any thoughts there, Nick?
No, I mean, I think Amy's slide on kind of some of the pillars of doing feminist data culture, I find her very instructive and things that I want to reflect on more in how we produce killer stats and do research. So, kind of thinking about intention, thinking about transparency, thinking about where data comes from, who has access, is it inclusive? And of course, for me, the reason I work for Oxfam is I think is very much grounded in feminist principles of like, we want to challenge power hierarchies that exist in the world and that create and perpetuate inequalities. So, kind of for my own takeaway, or what I'm trying to bring more into my work is how can a framework like that, how can that be more of a framework, in terms of how I think about my own work? And maybe that's useful for whomever asked the question.
Well, thank you to you both. All right, our next industry seminar is December 12th with Nathan Sanders from Monti Health and Flagship Partners. And with that, I just want to say thank you again to Amy and Nick, and we'll see you all next time. All right, take care, everyone.